welcome to today's video in the research method series on the topic of variables. In today's video, we will cover the following four aspects. We start by studying about why variables are important to study. We then go on to answering the question, what are variables? Following that, we study about the key characteristics of variables, and then we finish up with looking at the different types of variables and understand this with some examples. I will leave you at the end of the video with some information about a good reference that you could use to study more about this topic, or in fact any topic in research methods that is used in psychology and cognitive sciences. So without further ado, let's get on to it. Let's start by asking the question, firstly, why study about variables? And I think that's a fantastic question because it helps you set the motivation to study this topic. Now, in this video today, I will discuss two reasons why studying about variables is important in the context of research methods and cognitive sciences. But of course, this is not a limited list. There are lots of other reasons as well. But the two most important and rather obvious reasons are as follows. Now, firstly, we're interested in studying about variables because the goal of any field of scientific research, cognitive sciences and psychology included, is to discern what the key variables of interest are in a specific area of research that you are studying or conducting your studies in. In that, we could be interested in studying what the specific variables are, why do they vary as they do, what the different dynamics of these variables are, and so on and so forth. Now, because of this reason, understanding what variables are, or what the key characteristics of variables are, or what the different types of variables are, is very, very important. And it therefore forms a key step in the stages to designing an experiment. Now, in a separate video, we have covered the 6 steps in designing an experiment, which you can check out by clicking the I button on the top or the link in the description below. But that aside, here we have the first reason why we must have a good understanding of variable. Let's now move on to the second reason why having a good understanding of the variables as a topic is important. The second reason for having a good understanding of variables is because understanding your variables informs and guides your decision of choosing appropriate statistical tests in the analysis stage of your experimental process. Now, this is really important because appropriate tests lead to appropriate inferences, and therefore having a good understanding of variables is very crucial because it informs you which tests or which processes in your data analysis has to be applied. So that wraps up the two reasons why we should be studying the topic of variables, why we need to have a good grasp of the topic, the different types and the characteristics of the variables. So now that we have our motivation straight and we have answered the question why we should study about variables, let's move on further to answering the question, what are variables? So what are variables? Now, in research, the things that we measure are called variables, and they can be defined as anything that changes over time. Now, because the focus of research is on studying the dynamics of these variables, they remain the main focus of the research in any scientific field, as we discussed already previously. In short, variables are anything that vary, and hence the name variable. And they can take on different values or different categories and so on and so forth. Let's look at some examples. Some examples of variable include gender, or studying about one's age, or studying about the concept of intelligence quotient or emotional quotient, etc. Now, why are these variables? Because simply they are things that we can measure and we can record, and they are things that vary from one situation to another, or from one participant to another, and so on and so forth. So this, hopefully, in short, gives us a clear understanding of what variables are. They are anything that change, and they are the main focus of interest. Let's now move on forward to learn about the main characteristics of variables. So what are the key characteristics of variables? Variables can be categorical in nature. They could be continuous in nature, or they could be discrete in nature. Let's look at each of these topics a little more in detail. Let's start by understanding what are continuous variables, or what is the continuous characteristic of a variable. Now, continuous variables are any variables that can take up to any value within a given range. That is, continuous variables are variables that can take on any value within a range, and they do not therefore have discrete jumps. Continuous variables are considered to be metric or quantitative variables, where the variable can have an infinite number or value between two given points. Now, to expand on that a little bit, a variable is continuous if it is theoretically possible for the members of the group to fall anywhere on a given spectrum with small amounts of a characteristic on one end and large amounts of a characteristic on the other end. Continuous variables are often, therefore, measured in infinitely small units. Let's look at an example. Reaction time, which is a very common behavioral measure accounted by numerous cognitive tasks in psychology or cognitive sciences, is a very good example of a continuous variable because reaction times can take up any value. For example, participants here can have different reaction times. So the first participant has a reaction time of 400.342 milliseconds, whereas the reaction time for the other two participants are around 340.249 milliseconds or 140.323 milliseconds. And you can see that these values have taken up to any value within a given range. So thus, reaction times are really good examples of continuous variables, or the continuous nature of variables, because they can take up any value. Let's now look at discrete variables. Discrete variables are any variables that can take only a certain value in a given range. Discrete variables are therefore countable in a finite amount of time. A good example of a discrete variable can be a Likert rating scale, which is very commonly used as a rating scale in psychology research that, for example, uses questionnaires in its data collection process. This is a discrete variable because your responses on a Likert scale can only take up to a certain discrete value over an interval. So if you're asked the question, do you like chocolate? You could either respond strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, or strongly disagree. Or different participants can have different ratings. Participant A can say strongly agree, B can say neither agree nor disagree, and C could just say strongly disagree or disagree, and so on and so forth. So because these responses on the Likert scale can only take up to a certain discrete value over the interval given here, we refer to Likert scale as a good example of discrete variables, or the responses to the Likert scale as a discrete variable. Let's now move on to the next type, which is the categorical variables. Now, categorical variables are those variables in which we simply allocate participants to specific categories, and therefore the name categorical variables. When dealing with categorical data, we have a finite number of variables that we might wish to investigate. Let's look at an example for categorical variable. A good example of categorical variable is gender, where we can have a specific category such as males versus females put into two simple categories as shown here, or two groups in which one receives a certain type of an intervention while the other group does not. That is also a good example of a categorical variable. So in summary, variables can be continuous in nature, wherein they take up to any value within a given range. They could be categorical in nature, wherein they are simply allocated to specific categories, or they could be discrete in nature, wherein they take up only a certain value within a given range. Now, moving forward, let's try to understand how can we distinguish if the variables are continuous, discrete, or categorical. In order to elicit the difference between our variables as categorical, discrete, or continuous, we have to consider two key aspects. The first aspect pertains to the way we look at our variable or think about our variable. And the second aspect pertains to the way we measure our variable. Let's understand this a little better with an example. Now, a variable in theory may be continuous, but the way we measure it could be discrete. So, we could measure, for example, anxiety, which theoretically is a continuous variable, using a questionnaire such as the State Trait Anxiety Inventory, which was proposed by Spielberg and colleagues in 1983. Here, the participants would receive a total score on the questionnaire, which gives an indication of the person's level of anxiety. Now, the total scores on this questionnaire can only increase in whole units, say from 38 to 39, or from 34 to 36, and so on. Thus, the way we measured anxiety in this case is discrete, whereas the underlying variable that we measure is assumed to be continuous. So this highlighted that the way we measured our data in this example essentially decided the characteristic of the variable of interest, which in this case was discrete in nature. Let's now move on to studying about the different types of variables. What are the main types of variables? Now, there are two main types of variables. Firstly, there is independent variable, and secondly, there is dependent variable. So, what is independent variable? Independent variables are any variable that essentially are actively manipulated by the experimenter and only the experimenter. The dependent variable, on the other hand, is the variable which is assumed to be dependent upon the independent variable. In other words, dependent variables are variables that change as a function of the changes in independent variables. Let's understand these concepts a little better with an example of a memory study. Suppose you are designing a study wherein you want to discern the changes in the number of items recalled and the recall accuracy of those items when participants are subjected to a memory-specific training versus a non-memory training group. So for this study, for example, you have recruited a population of participants. You then randomly allocate these participants to two different groups, which is memory training versus a non-memory training group, which in this case could be spatial skills training. Note that at this stage you haven't actively subjected any participants in either of these groups to any type of training. You have just divided them. The participants are then given a task wherein they have to study and learn two different lists. In list 1, the participants have to learn 12 pairs of names and faces, and in list 2, the participants are instructed to learn different cities and famous cuisine or dishes found in those cities, and 12 pairs of them as well. Following this, the participants from both the groups are subjected to a pre-training measure or a pre-training test, wherein we subject them to a recall test, a memory recall. So let's look at some mock data that has been generated for the recall tests across the two groups. Remember that the participants in each of these groups have not been subject to any active training yet, and therefore we are getting a pre-training measure of the performance in the recall test. Also remember that we are interested in two key measures of interest, which is the number of items recalled and the recall accuracy performance. So here we have the mock data for the two groups, and we observed that the performance of each of the groups does not differ that much in either of the recall accuracy or the items recalled. Now we subject the participants in each of the groups to active training sessions. In the memory training, the participants learn about different strategies to better encode, store, and retrieve and recall information. So In other words, they get better in their memory capacities. And in the spatial skills group, they learn how to better their spatial skills that has got nothing to do with their memory at all. Following this active training, the participants retake the recall test, and then we account for their post-training measures. Let's look at some mock data of the post-training measures. Here we have some mock data for the post-training, and we observe that the memory training group has done fairly well in both the number of items recalled as well as the recall accuracy as compared to the spatial skills training group. So let's try to pause the video for a second and try to name the independent and the dependent variable in this study to test our knowledge. I hope you have paused the video and tried to test your knowledge. Let's look at the answers. So the independent variable in this example study was the type of training session the participants were subjected to, because this was actively manipulated by the experimenter or the researcher. The dependent variable, on the other hand, was the number of items recalled and the recall accuracy, because these aspects were dependent on the type of training session the participants were subjected to. So hopefully that consolidates your understanding of independent and dependent variables. Let's now move on to the last part of the video that talks about the variables that we need to be careful of. Now we have to be careful of a specific type of variable that is referred to as the extraneous variable. Now, extraneous variable can be defined as the variables that might have an impact on the other variables that we are interested in, but we may have failed to take these into account when we were designing our studies. Now, this can be very dangerous because this can mess up the whole study in terms of the interpretations that we make at the end. We do not go in much detail about extraneous variables, which can be a topic for a separate video, but we talk a little bit about a specific type of extraneous variable referred to as confounding variables. Now, confounding variables basically force us to answer this question which is present on the screen now. How do we know that the change in the dependent variable that we observe is caused due to or as a function of the independent variable? Confounding variables can be defined as a specific type of extraneous variable that is related to both of the main variables that we are interested in. Thus, having confounding variables interfere in our study makes it very, very difficult to clearly isolate if the changes in our dependent variable was due to the independent variable or some other factor that casts the same effect on the dependent variables as the independent variable of interest would have. Let's look at the possible confounding variables that could have affected the recall accuracy and the number of items recalled in our memory training study example. A common confound could be age. If the two training groups are not age matched, then any difference in recall performance could not be attributed to the type of training session, because significant age differences can introduce differences in cognitive competencies, which then lead to the differences in the performance, which is absolutely independent of the training session or the independent variable of interest. The second confound is if the experiment was undertaken in the same environment or not. Now, if the two groups are tested in different environments, then the conclusions pertaining to the effectiveness of training sessions impacting recall performance might be inaccurate, because different lab environments can either enhance or hinder one's cognitive abilities as well. The third possible confound pertains to one's educational background. If participants are not fairly matched for their backgrounds and their education, this could also interfere in their recall performance, which could be again independent of the training session type that they are subjected to. Finally, If the participants have a diagnosis of a specific psychological or neurological condition, this could also impact their recall performance, and thus the difference in recall performance could be stemming from the difference of having a specific condition but not as a function of the difference in training session types. So let's summarize what we learned in today's video. We learned that variables are anything that change and they are the main focus of any research study. We also learned that variables can be categorized as either continuous, categorical, or discrete, and the way we categorize them depends on the way we look at the variable and the way we measure the variable that we have collected. We also learned that there are two main types of variables: independent variables, which are variables that are actively manipulated by the experimenter and nothing else, and dependent variable, which changes a function of the changes in the independent variable. Finally, we looked at the types of variables that we have to be careful of, which included a specific type of extraneous variable called confounding variable, which is something that is related to both the independent and the dependent variable of interest, and something that has to be accounted for when you're laying out or designing your study, or else it can affect the interpretations of the study and can lead to erroneous conclusions. So that is the end of today's video. As promised at the beginning of the video, I want to leave you with a good reference that you can study or use for studying this topic or any other topic, and engage in solving some exercises to consolidate your understanding further. So this is a book called as the Statistics Without Maths for Psychology by authors Dancy and Reedy, and it is a fantastic resource that you can use to study this topic further, or any inferential statistical tests used in psychology or cognitive sciences in general. So thank you for watching. See you in our next video.